to be discussing the paper written by Shanthi Sente, who is making her way down now. And I think this is going to be a fantastic conversation to finish up the day. So thank you both.
Great. Oh, thanks everybody. This is such a pleasure to be here. It's such a pleasure to be with you talking about this paper, GameFace, Legal Tackle on Facial Recognition and Privacy Rights at NFL Games. I know, yes, I know this is the last paper of the conference. The room is a little warm, but we can power through, and I think we'll have a really good discussion. So I'll just start by just kind of giving a bit of an overview of the paper. The paper starts with I think a really compelling and frankly moving anecdote that illustrates some of the potential dangers or pitfalls, not just in terms of abstract rights, but also in terms of the lived experience of being wrongly identified or misidentified potentially by a facial recognition system. In this context, in the case of going to a Detroit Lions game, and I think this is a really great start, in part because it highlights the fact, right, that there are always people who are caught in the kind of problematic and often very dubious sort of digital webs of FRT technologies. Moving on from there, the paper sort of looks at the question of facial recognition in NFL stadia, which has become basically pretty much, from my reading, standard in the last couple of years, as a kind of illustrative case of the dangers of these technologies. And I think especially an illustrative case for their dangers to Black and other racialized folks who, as much research has suggested, right, are disproportionately impacted by these technologies, both, as we were talking about in the earlier panel, both when they work and when they don't work, right? So there's a problem here, right, that these systems are not particularly accurate against non-white faces, but, and I totally agree with this, right, we don't actually really want them to be accurate given their deployment in sets of kind of carceral systems, including the kind of management of large sporting events like this one. So I think that the paper is I think really generative and really interesting. I think that I did have a question as I went through it about, we talked about the law of the horse the other day, whether this is the law of the NFL stadium, in as much as that I was wondering, to what extent is this case, is it an agglomeration of different kind of questions around notice of consent and other kind of questions around privacy and data access that are converging in the site of the stadium? I think it is that, but I think it's also more than that, and I think that's partly what this work is so valuable for. And I so I think as you develop it and build it out, I think there's a lot to say here. So a few things. So one thing I really liked about this piece was the way it situates NFL stadiums as kind of spaces that are both hybrid public and private spaces, right? And I actually had more questions about that because at one point in the paper you talk about the kind of range of legal relationships that stadiums and in fact, frankly, even teams have with the public, the people who come to watch the games, right? So some teams, some stadia are technically owned by the municipality, right? But even those that aren't owned by the municipality, many of them have been constructed with very large tax breaks, right? And so I thought I had questions about, to what extent does does the publicness of a stadium, of an NHL stadium, or frankly any stadium, how does that play into the analysis? I think it does in some way, but I should say I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what I am. I'm a historian who dabbles in ethics policy. So I don't know enough about the law to know what those differences might do, and I'd love more of that in future drafts. The other thing that I thought was really interesting about the paper that I think you could expand is sort of getting deeply into, first of all, the kind of different flavors of FRT, right? Because facial recognition technology tends to have a pretty, it's kind of as a general category, at least to my read, tends to involve three different subcategories, right? It's the identification of a face, right? Is there any random face? Then is that face identifiable against a database of other faces? And then there's the analysis, right? And so it's like, okay, what kind of face is it? Is it a female face, a male face? So applying categories which don't work very well onto that image. And so I think in the anecdote that opens the piece, it's clearly it's identification, or rather, yeah, it's identification. It's comparing one to one, this person, or misidentification. But I wondered about the specifics of what the policies and FRT, the FRT policies for NHL stadium or NFL stadiums say, because there's a big difference. And I think you bring up rightly, the many problems that we've seen around facial analysis, right? The kind of issues around identification, the possibility that facial analysis data can be sold or packaged or can circulate right behind the scenes when nobody knows what's happening to it. But I think that of course if the NFL isn't doing that, they probably are thinking about it. But it would make sense to sort of kind of have a sense exactly of what kind of FRT technology is in place, and whether that differs by stadium, right, or differs by team, differs by city. It may not. So I thought I was really curious about that, and I was interested. I'll be interested to see where that goes. And I also was really interested in not just the specifics of the NHL, see hockey, the NFL's the kind of technologies that the NFL stadiums are using, but also like if there are kind of like what the kind of policies at the league level are, if there are any. You get into that a little bit, I think, but even more would be interesting. So that was one set of questions I had. Then the one further kind of question about this point about what different teams do in different places, it has to do specifically with the Chicago Bears, who may or may not be. Is this a rivalry with the Detroit Lions? I don't know. I'm not an NFL person. Maybe.
I didn't know that good enough yet.
Fair enough. Because as you point out in the piece, right, the Illinois biometric privacy law is sort of, has been one of the rarest success stories in this space. And yet it seemed by my reading that the Bears are also using facial recognition or facial analysis. Oh, not yet. Okay. So what I was, yeah. So if there's, being very explicit or clear about how that state level law is shaping what they're doing differently, also provides like a nice avenue towards what do we do about this, right? How do we solve this problem? And then I also had a number of other questions around. This is a fascinating topic, and I'd love there to be more about not just the NFL, but also what other leagues do. I mean, you note that a little bit briefly in there, right? What are the kind of, even as kind of brief comparative aside, does the NFL's policy on facial recognition differ from other professional leagues? Even more interestingly, perhaps in stadia are there any stadia that still do both football and baseball? I'm not sure. Maybe not anymore. Because what I was going to ask was whether or not there was if it's at the same venue, are there differences based on league policy or venue policy? So I thought that was interesting. And then the other really maybe kind of thorny but interesting case analog would be, what about college football? And how does college football is this conversation about facial recognition as a security question happening on college football campuses, right, often, which are definitely very much public owned, right? And how does that potentially differ? I also was really curious about the players. How do the players feel about, or if they engage? If there's been response to questions about FRT, especially because, right, as you get to in the second part of the paper, because of the disproportionate impacts on racialized folks, and of course because of the, the disproportionate racial labor of the NFL, right, where the people making all the money for the owners are largely, certainly a much higher proportion of racialized folks than the owners are. So I think that would be a really interesting thing to add too. Let's see. So what were some of the so on page 6 you sort of say this all, the general put of the paper, right, sheds light on the broader legal landscape of biometric surveillance, offering insights applicable to any arena where technology, I like that pun, it's good, where technology and privacy intersect, as well as the increase in the commercialization of the mass data captured. And so I was sort of like noting down from my reading of the paper, what are the insights that you're providing, specific insights, and I think there are a number. One is what I would call the securitization of sports, right? Which I think is probably, you could really build that out. You draw nice, connections to the kind of efflorescence of biometric technologies post 9/11, right? But I think there could be even more there around the kind of association of professional sports in the United States with patriotism, with the state, and then all of the kind of tensions there, coming all the way up to Colin Kaepernick and kind of those questions over the last 5 years. So I think the securitization of sports is really notable. I think the other thing again, not a lawyer, but I thought that I was really curious about the ins and outs of the notice and consent regimes in these different stadia. So I'm guessing it's probably, the contract is probably it's the ticket, I assume. There's some, when you buy the ticket, you consent to all sorts of things. And then maybe there is some sign on the wall. So first of all, I was interested in a more descriptive, like, kind of walkthrough of exactly what maybe a typical, if there's a typical, or what a stadium's facial recognition kind of policy looks like. But then also, and then maybe also how that notice and consent, like how the notice of consent for facial recognition is in some ways a kind of is just the latest in that securitization of the arena, because you note throughout the paper questions about searches at the gate and all these questions, and so I tend to think of new technological innovations as effects of bigger ideological questions, and so to me it's the securitization that swims in the water that has sort of prompted, everybody has to check your bag, and also now you have FRT. Let's see what else I want to say. A couple of and then sorry, and I think one of the big insights from this piece, which I'm totally here for, right, is when, if ever, is FRT reasonable and context driven, right? I'm not, I wrote a paper about 6 or 7 years ago called "Facial Recognition is the Plutonium of AI," right? So I actually really think, this plays off of the last panel too, I am totally fine with saying there are many situations in which this is totally inappropriate. I tend to think of the failings of FRTs as a kind of rotten onion model, right? That, like, there's a problems with its deployment, that if you strip that away, there's the technical problems around accuracy. And then if you strip that away, you've got the conceptual problem, which is essentially assigning numbers to human bodies and faces. And I've argued this is intrinsically racializing, right? Because you're creating hierarchies, even if you don't mean to, within the kind of that association. So I generally think these things are almost useless, and so I would totally be behind a strong, prescription of these tools in this context, like many. A couple of just like quick things. I think on page 13, I think there's a typo. It's Simone Brown, not Sylvia Brown.
Oh, yeah.
And then one book that I think might be helpful, it's now a little older, but I think it's still really good, is Kelly Gates's Our Biometric Future, which she's really writing this book in the context of 9/11, and might be helpful. And then the final thing. So at the end of the paper, you talk about remedies, right, a little bit, like this idea of a facial recognition harm compensation fund. I wondered about enforcement there, and I also wondered about whether, again, it might just be easier to, like, say, in an ideal world, we just ban these things and don't have to worry about the conversating people in some way. But if that's unrealistic, I think that, yeah, there would be questions about how, how would you know there's a violation? How, there are all sorts of questions there that might be a little sticky. So yeah, I think that the paper is really interesting. It's really rich. I think you're drawing you're drawing on to I think the kind of sports law. And you can tell me if you've seen more of this, but I haven't seen a lot of integration of sports law with the work on biometric surveillance, on critical race technology studies that I think you're doing really well here. So I think it's really rich, and just sort of finally, it's asked us what is, how do we understand mass impacts of surveillance in the context of individual harms, right? And I think it's really it's a really good move to sort of show the NFL and the NFL fan as the mass, right? That this is something that even that really does have very broad appeal across demographics, across racialized groups, across gender even, and so I think I think there is something here about this question about the NFL stadium as a kind of space that really does have a public function, even if it's technically private, and how we need to sort of navigate that a little bit. So I'll stop there. But yeah, I think it's great, and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much for your generous comments, and thank you so much, Kristen, for this amazing conference, and to the organizing committee. We're the last panel, so I'm not going to be, I'm not going to take my. I'm not going to talk slow. I'm going to talk real fast. So you can all. So again, thank you. For your insightful thoughts on my paper. This was a very first draft. This is really an extension of my broader work. I look at biometrics and athletes and how players are basically measured and how their injuries are sort of tracked, and how they perform on the court, off the court, sort of surveillance, right? Commercial surveillance of the type of outputs that come out is the data. Right? How far can you jump? How much can you weigh? How much do you weigh? I mean, when I was doing this sort of biometric study, which is outside of this paper, there was sort of a whole study around abdominal construction of athletes and NFL linebackers, right? So data is being extracted at very sort of on crazy levels, at micro levels. And I just thought about the whole sort of extraction, the plantation model, ownership structure, that we've sort of the brutal history of enslaved people, especially in America. And it sort of mirrors that sort of same thing, except in a commercial and more technological space. And so when the NFL announced last year that they're going to roll out FRT, and 32 teams are going to be using this, there was a sort of pushback by some advocacy groups and also people within the sports law space. Is like, okay, we know that it has problems. We've seen it in law enforcement examples, and we also saw it in the Madison Square Garden example. Have you guys heard about that, where a lawyer tried to enter the venue and they were turned away or excluded because they were on the opposing side? The facial recognition technique recognized that this particular lawyer was working for the opposing side in a litigation matter. So they used facial recognition technology to exclude this particular ticket holder based on on an outside situation, right? So again, these are all connected, and the data that I'm more interested in is how is it being used? When you're a ticket holder and you're using your funds to potentially enjoy a game, what are sort of your rights and obligations? And really, when I started talking about this to some of my friends and people who are NFL diehard fans, they were like, who gives a shit? It's just a game. Like, they can just leave, or, and these are also racialized and non-racialized people. And, but it's not, it's a bit beyond that. The sort of analysis needs to be about that. The principle of being at a space where you have this and I write about this collective anxiety, even us crossing the border. I cross the border like 4 times a week. So now I'm like, oh my God, are they going to search my car? Like, they search my car much more than they did 5 months ago. You have this particular invisible anxiety when you're supposed to be enjoying yourself. And how does it affect sort of the NFL apparatus? We know that the NFL is not just the NFL. It is like a beacon of American culture. It has so much power. It has, and now more so than ever in this climate. So yes, securitization is not new in sports. It's not a new concept within sports organizations because they've used it in the Olympics and all the way to the 1970s. We know it's part of that whole, again, that industrial complex that sort of surveils and captures data around people who are within those confines. I thought about using different theoretical framings. For example, the panopticon, and there's so much written on the panopticon, and I was like, that's unhelpful. And I'm going to go back to the end of the paper. We know that FRT produces inaccurate results. It's not whether, it's when. So how do I combat that particular moment with a legal solution? How do I address that with a legal solution? I know in other sort of legal spheres, there are funds that have been created to redress a harm. We don't have time to go to court. We don't have time to litigate our pain yet again in, with arbitrator, mediator, or in a settlement. I think you use my data inaccurately and it harmed me. I might have lost my job. I might have been ejected from the game. I might have had, more law enforcement interactions or encounters. I deserve compensation for this particular harm. It's simple. So why don't we create a fund? I think it was just very ambitious and maybe reckless at the same time in creating this sort of thought process, or sort of putting down my thought process in this paper. And I think when we think about the new sort of expansive ways FRT is being rolled out, we see it in shopping. I know in Canadian Tire used it in BC, I believe. They use it for sort of price. I know in your work, Pascal, price personalization. FRT is being used to see what people buy. And this brings me to my next part of my sort of thought process. While I was researching this paper, I myself became a victim of the algorithm, and I was forced to buy something at 2 a.m. As many of, I don't know, do you guys doom scroll at night? It's such a bad habit, but okay, I usually shouldn't be on Amazon, but I should be boycotting. But in the middle of the night, I saw something. Hey, how do you want to protect yourself from facial recognition technology?
Okay.
And this type of clothing, and I literally, and this is so ridiculous, I actually bought this for $20. And this is supposed to protect me against FRT technology. Do I don't know, is that true?
Yeah, I wonder.
Like literally. And then of course you have, I don't know whether you guys know MIA, who's a popular rapper. She came out with this particular clothing line called Omni that is supposed to protect you from all sorts of other sort of technological invasion. But these are all questions that I'm thinking about from a very pragmatic perspective. And I really appreciate your comments, especially with the whole private public sort of hybrid situation that happens in public stadiums or private stadiums. For example, we know that a lot of these stadiums where the NFL plays are not solely owned by the particular team. Thank you. They're owned by the public and private ownership because of the tax subsidies and also because of other sort of agreements or engagements with the community. For example, Green Bay Packers is an example. And I mean, we could talk about that in terms of from American perspective, 14th Amendment situations, and so we could talk about that later in the Q&A. But I know that you just said we should move to the Q&A. So
right,
I welcome all
yeah,
questions.
Questions. Questions disguised as comments, comments disguised as questions.
I'm not a cat person and I don't like kids. Just kidding. No, I'm not.
Oh, no.
I'm kidding.
Sue,
Then-
they're on to you, Sue.
Yeah. we're-
Yes, I guess.
I'm kidding. of course.
For the sake of the whatever it is, I'm Sue Gluck. I no longer work for Meowcrosoft, but I do work for my cat, Tatters Kitty Gluck Inc.
Oh.
It's my employer. She has a little bit of a suggestion for you.
Yes.
And I think I'll start with mine and I'll end
Okay.
with hers. But actually, I'm going to put Luke to work first.
Okay.
Helen Niesenbaum. What's obfuscation? What's the name of that?
Oh yeah. It's a paper with Finn Brunton and a book. Oh yeah, obfuscation. Yeah. So yeah. So that's right.
But it says more than that. But this is like, you know, how to hide in plain sight. I mean, mostly online, but I think it might be some nice inspiration. I like putting the discussant to work also.
Yeah.
Earn
Well,
your keep.
and this is I mean this the shirt is a nice example. There's a whole set of there have been a whole set of projects as you're mentioning of like obfuscatory makeup design,
Yeah.
Yeah.
clothing design.
Hat. You should have gotten a hat.
Yeah.
I think that.
A MAGA hat.
No, I mean, oh, sorry.
I would have really been disguised. I would really disguise.
But if I could really just quickly, I mean, I think so. It's an interesting. The obfuscation point is an interesting good point. There was somebody who was just kicked off of a plane, I think, because he was wearing an anti-Trump T-shirt.
Oh.
So the question of so of course, there's that level of control as part of the securitization of private space, including the arenas. They might not let you wear that.
Wasn't there someone also kicked out in Toronto for wearing a "You Can't Buy Canada"?
Oh, that's what it was. Yeah, right. Yeah, at the Blue Jays game.
I didn't read the whole story, so I
Yeah,
wasn't sure
That's right.
whether it was in an arena, was it outside.
No, it was at the Rogers Center.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
Rogers Center. Okay, I'm good.
Sorry, Sue.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is all good. Yeah, no, I was thinking maybe you might want a Faraday bag to put your phone and your laptop in so that you're not tracked
Yeah.
like that as well. So we
Okay.
could turn this into a workshop session
Yeah.
next year.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
let's think about it. If there is a next year. Ouch. Yeah, I know what you mean. Okay, so a few recommendations from me.
Yeah.
One is I love the example that you start with, but it would be nice to maybe develop it and weave it through you can use it as an organizing thing. And it actually doesn't even have to be exactly that scenario or a series of scenarios, or perhaps it unfolds over time. But I think that's a really great way to keep someone like feeling it viscerally. And I think that moves people, and you have a lot of passion for the topic. And I think you want to leave your reader with the same thing. And you already do this, but I think it could be even better if you use that. And I love good storytelling, so that's just a thing for me. I think you should look at some materials from other jurisdictions, and look, they may not end up in your paper, but I think it's good inspiration. So one source, and I will email you these things because they're not necessarily the easiest things to find. Okay, at University Grenoble Alpes in France, I guess, there's a professor named Theodore Christakis, and he's got like a chair, an AI chair at the university, but he's a lawyer by training. And I think they released a 6-part study called Mapping the Use of Facial Recognition in Public Spaces in Europe. And to your point about, in Europe, they consider a stadium just that because you have to get a ticket.
they still consider that to be a public space. So he excludes fully private spaces, like, go to a corporation and, you can't get in there, like, unless you do the facial recognition. That's different. But in public spaces, including stadiums or stadia, never heard that before. Also, I think particularly helpful, there's a report out of an Australian human, I didn't write down what the name of the center is called, sorry. Former Human Rights Commissioner Edward Santo is at UTS, University of Technology Sydney now. And he and a team of experts researched and released a proposed model law to govern facial recognition technology. And the report is excellent. It's even like worth reading to the end, because in one of the appendices, there's a facial recognition impact assessment template so that the NFL could use. I mean, some of it is not directed at the customer, but at the vendor, but there's actually a checklist to use, but really clear, lots of really good stuff there. Part of what they did before they created the model law content was to do a study called something like face value, where they had sort of, you looked at a tablet or something and it walked you through, you can't get into your building unless you consent to the facial recognition. You can't get a bank account unless you consent to facial recognition. I think one of the scenarios may have been, you can't go to the stadium unless you consent to facial rec. Unfortunately, and I'll leave this to you after I email you the link, I can't find the actual results of the study they did, but they ran a bunch of people through it. And yeah, I can only find like a blurb, but I'm sure there's something more out there. And I think that would be both inspirational and actually helpful. Okay, and now we have Tatter's feedback. So Tatters is a big fan of Woody Hartzog. Mm-hmm. He fed her dinner once, and that was all it took. She was part of a VIP experience he was able to enjoy out near Seattle. And so I saw that she saw that you have a Medium article that Woody co-authored with Evan Selinger. And Tatters suggests you also check out the bigger, like, academic paper that's based on the unconsentability of facial surveillance. I don't think that's actually a word, unconsentability, but I think it's awesome that they made it up. And that is such a big problem. How do you consent? So,
thank you so much.
Not everybody gets feedback from Tatters, so
yeah, I'm very honored. Actually, I know I didn't see Woody, but I did. I think his paper that he presented yesterday. I feel like it's been weeks. Might be actually helpful in what I'm trying to do towards the end of my paper. And the only reason I made it very sort of simplistic is because it's just specific to the NFL, which is a private commercial entity that has a ton of money and a ton of political and social power. So it's easy to sort of control or try to bring them to the table. And also it acts as a deterrent, and it's a punitive, curative, and a sort of a social
well, I think there's
experiment.
huge value in use cases that when you can focus in on something tangible and real, that can illuminate, for people who don't necessarily see the forest, they see the trees. It can help them see the forest and what we should be doing on a broader basis. So I thought focusing on the NFL was great. So, as did Tatters.
In the beginning, I kind of took the path of thinking through about discrimination. But I'm like, why am I even going through that exercise? I know it exists. That's just a waste of time for me. So I just kind of pivoted.
Well, I wish we could go back in time, and I think you and Woody should have sat down and had, because his head is full of facial recognition knowledge.
Maybe I'll email him.
I think you should.
I will.
Okay. Anyway, thank you.
Thank
Love
you
the
so-
paper.
Thanks.
I think it's a great topic, and I'm excited to see where you take it.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
I'll just so one thing that Sue, it's okay. Thank you. One thing that this
Keep
makes me
going.
think of,
Yeah.
is that actually one of the, I mean, and Sue, you've helped me clarify this insight a little more sharply than I had said in my initial overview, was right that some of this is about pointing to the fact that these harms are ubiquitous, but in private settings, they're not always as available or clear to the public, right? So the reason we have a lot of evidence of the failures of facial recognition in something like policing is partly because, well, a combination of justified scrutiny by the press and by activists, but also because policing is in theory in theory it's publicly accountable in theory. Practice, but so as one contribution to the table, just making the point that, look, in these spaces that in this continent we consider private but are actually public, really de facto public, when this comes up, when the NFL rolls this out, you're going to see cases like this over and over again, because that is just intrinsic to the failures of the technology.
Yeah.
Are they private? Because look, I know nothing about sports ball, but don't municipalities pay lots of money and
That's
build new stadiums and stuff?
That sort of debate we've been talking about since actually maybe before 2016, especially when Colin Kaepernick's sort of the kneeling moment happened. Is it private? Is it protected speech? Is it is it in a public space or a private space? And we do know municipalities do subsidize stadiums, and community engagement is needed, community consultation is needed, but who actually funds it? Municipal bonds in some cases. So some scholars advocate for a case-by-case analysis, and some scholars are saying, look, these are public spaces anyway, the public, sort of community doctrine or public property doctrine. I don't know, maybe Professor Venkatesh can talk about that a little bit. I don't know much about that area, but in terms of how do we characterize these spaces, and that's really important, the site of where these power structures interact, that would be interesting. And that just reminded me, you asked me about the athletes and players with respect to FRT. They're actually not part of this analysis because it's about entering the stadium to watch them. And they're probably monitored differently and surveilled in with different methodologies. But I was more sort of interested in this sort of mass of surveillance of people. And I think it's also, like I mentioned in my paper, it's fodder for the companies. They're getting new people every day to all these games, hundreds and thousands of people, where they can just, use these types of FRT, scanning systems from different angles using drones, and I'm not sure.
And how do they use that data later?
I mean, we could be surveilled right now in this space.
Are we?
There's a camera up there.
There's cameras right now.
Uh-oh. Anyway.
So just really quickly, yeah, I mean, my comment about the players, it wasn't so much that they would be caught up in this particular regime, but more to what they think about it from a kind of, because there are,
Well, I did, when I was doing this paper, I talked to an ex NFL player, like in Detroit, who I sometimes, work with on certain things. And he was one of the people like, who cares? They can just not watch the game. So that was his response.
Right.
But because he didn't think it through about the facts, he didn't think about the impact. I might get excluded now from talking about the fund. I
Well,
may
the-
not get tickets anymore.
Well, this was my point. Yeah, that even if the individual, like, there's a question about because players often do have friends and family
Yeah.
who come to the games. I'm sure some. I mean,
Yeah.
some of them I'm sure are more tied into this than
Right.
others. There's a big
Exactly.
spectrum of opinion
Yeah.
in athletes anyway, right?
I think it was just flip,
Yeah.
because no one's really thought about the impact. Because even at Disneyland, I think I spoke to you, Kristen, FRT is being used in Disneyland.
Oh yeah, and fingerprint analysis.
Yeah.
But the other thing about the point about the players versus the crowd, it would also be interesting to think about, like, I don't know whether it would be possible to get an insight into this, but like the kind of, if there's any kind of integration of the FRT strategies by the front office, like, okay, so like, so as you're saying, they're doing incredibly detailed, biometric, physiognomic analysis of
Yeah.
athletes. Maybe that's a totally separate data stream. Maybe that has nothing to do with the kind of the FRT. So that would be just interesting
Yeah.
to think about what are the different streams of surveillance happening in the football stadium.
Yeah.
There are probably more than one.
Okay.
Do you want to
Yes.
go? Yeah, Kristen, I think you're next.
Is that okay?
I think you were first.
I'm so tired of standing. I should just sit down.
Maybe we can get both questions and then I'll just
Oh.
answer.
No,
I'll see what Chris's question is first.
I was gonna say I'll see what Cynthia asked. and
Oh.
I'll modify mine.
Okay. Oh, actually, no, mine wasn't questions. It was recommendations.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
You give your recommendations and then I'll ask my question.
Okay. So first of all, people have totally been thinking about the impact of facial recognition technology, including on racialized groups. Sue had mentioned looking to other jurisdictions, which I would definitely second. So for instance, Claire Garvey, formerly she was at Georgetown Law. Now she's at the U.S. National Defense. It's their national. It's like the USCLA, like it's the National Defense Council's. And so she wrote a report called "The Perpetual Lineup: Unregulated Police Facial
Yeah.
Recognition." Yeah, in 2016.
Yes, I saw that.
Okay, so since 2016, people have been working on facial recognition
Yes.
tech. And then, did you see the ETHI report here in Canada? So, like, we've been doing some work at the Citizen Lab, and then 1 or 2 years ago, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Privacy, Ethics, Privacy, and Access to Information did a parliamentary study on the use of facial recognition, and in the private sector, because you're right, like, maybe 90% of the scholarship and advocacy that's been done on recognition has been in the policing context and as against government actors. But there's starting to be like a burgeoning small bits and pieces of people focusing on private sector. So this ETHI report is one of them. The other is Fight for the Future in the US is one of the few NGOs that is focusing on private sector use of facial recognition in addition to public sector use. And then the third thing is that New York City Council was actually considering a bill to ban private sector use of facial recognition a while ago. Okay, I think that was everything.
Thanks.
Thank you. Just to address, thank you so much for your recommendations. I actually started this project ambitious about trying to do this comparative analysis between Canada and the US, but I realized the NFL, even in this climate, more so in this climate, is not going to expand into Canada. So I kind of dropped Canada from the analysis. So I didn't even look at any Canadian. I mean, there's I think Dr. Christian.
Gideon Christian?
What's his name?
Gideon?
Gideon Christian. Yes. In Calgary, he's doing a lot of work on this. But I started looking at his work, and I was like, yeah, why am I doing this? Because we're not going to be. I'm not.
Yeah,
The
not
NFL is
for-
not going to expand.
yeah, hopefully, yeah, we'll see, right? Maybe they also have expansionists.
Yeah.
But I think because especially in the tech field, everything is so multi-jurisdictional. Like we're constantly looking to US, we're constantly looking to EU. That I super believe in the idea of like transferability of things. So if we need evidence, for instance, or if people don't believe in impact or whatever, then yeah, the regulation might not apply. But if they've relied on empirical evidence, then like that's something that we can use to
Yeah.
apply for whatever context.
Yeah.
Hi. I have 2 questions. Feel free to take them or leave them. The first is small, the second is bigger. So the first is, don't judge me, but is there a distinction if the same venue, the same football stadium is using facial recognition surveillance on NFL fans, and then the next night using facial recognition surveillance, the same structure on Taylor Swift fans? Does it make a difference who the fans are in multi-use stadiums?
Okay.
And then my instinct is probably not, but I'm curious to hear what you think in terms of how that relates to the NFL specifically making this decision around FRT. And then the second question is maybe like the more conceptual question, which is, I mean, as I think you know, I do a lot of work on Amazon Ring, dealing with like some overlapping considerations, which has a lot to do with the public-private intersection, and the way in which a lot of what would otherwise be state surveillance that would be either like subjected to some transparency or illegal and could be challenged under constitutional protections. A lot of that is being delegated to corporations and private individuals and then returned to the state for its use in ways that if it had collected it directly might be legally questionable, if not illegal. And so I wonder, there's a reason for explaining that. Like, I wonder to what extent this is starting to become a freedom of association issue. Maybe includes a privacy surveillance issue, but does that expand into freedom of association when we see that a lot of our social gatherings and like the whole point of sport is to like get people together across all different interests and backgrounds, and like if that then becomes controlled through the use of corporate FRT that has little to no accountability, and that information could then also be delegated to the state in different ways, are we actually at risk of losing freedom of association in these public spaces that are privately owned through this kind of technology? And is that, you mentioned the NFL is like this cultural significance in the United States, right? Like is that actually challenging people's access to associating in a cultural venue that brings out maybe a bigger conceptual problem even than just the surveillance and the potential for inaccuracies?
I'm going to start with the easier question first. So it depends on who is paying for the software and what sort of security measures are being implemented. So the reason my paper focused on the NFL is because of the NFL policy on using or deploying FRT technology. Prior to this, there was a lot of sort of pushback because they used a pat down search method. So when you went for a particular game, they would have security in place to physically pat you down, and that was challenged in court as well. And sometimes upheld, sometimes not. And my paper gives that analysis. So this is just an extension of that securitization component when entering an NFL game. I think this whole obsession about law enforcement security and security personnel being proxies of law enforcement is endemic to NFL culture. If anyone's been to an NFL draft, as we had in Detroit last year, the NFL demanded that Detroit make sure that they had police officers at every single corner. The amount of FBI, Secret Service, any sort of every single level of law enforcement was at that spot in that very small space of 700,000 people and around it and above it and on the river outside. And if anyone's went to Detroit during that time, you would have seen it. It's those law enforcement officers were not from Detroit. They were actually hired from Buffalo, California, New Jersey. It was a big production. A lot of money was spent on that. So I'm not surprised that they're trying to either reduce their costs in order to implement the FRT systems. And with respect to the Taylor Swift concert goers, it depends on what the arrangements are on the promoters or even the stadium. Because right now, I don't think Little Caesars, for example, uses an FRT system.
I mean, they might.
They might.
They might actually.
They might, but I don't know whether they use it all the time. Like I've been to a few concerts there, and I don't remember.
It might be
being subject.
Pursuing, maybe. I mean, take it or leave it. But like, is it an infrastructural issue?
Maybe.
Or is it a cultural establishment
right.
issue? Right.
Or an obligation in order to bring the NFL to that space. Right? Hey, we'll do this so you can come here. Yeah. But even Detroit as a city is obviously very known to adopt and use FRT freely. Right now, there's we have ShotSpotter, we have the green light project. It's being used. I mean, the police department loves FRT technology. So there's lots of lawsuits that are happening as well. So again, it depends on the city. I think there is again, we have to look at it from a case by case basis. And if you talk to the mayor, they think that ShotSpotter is, you know,
These
to be
days,
is so successful because the homicide rates have gone down, crime has gone down. So again, do we know whether that's part of it, or is it because economic structures have been changed or have been transformed? I don't know. I don't know.
The other thing that makes me think about
Yeah.
is for the paper itself. I actually think some of the context of being explicit in the paper about the context of the NFL, its role as a nexus of especially with the Colin Kaepernick stuff, a nexus around racial justice in the last 5 years, and now a very severe backlash, right? Like one of the things we keep talking about in this is so in between submission and now, like what, how is the political situation changed the thinking? And I think that's in there. Because I think, I mean, you talk about the NFL security measures starting from 9/11, but I actually think, like for people, I think as a case study, this is extremely relevant. Some people who are even some Canadians are not NFL fans,
Right.
so having that context would be really helpful.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions or comments, or we want to take back the 3 minutes, or?
We only have 5 minutes left, so we can stop early.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Yeah, no, it's really. Brown's work is amazing.
I know, she's amazing. Yeah, my typos. I think in the footnotes I have her.
No, you improved, yeah.
Oh, hey.
Because I was writing so fast.
Yeah. Do you want to do? Oh yeah. Is that for the book?
More for your broader work. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Over here.
So they're from Australia.
Go for it.
I don't know
Yeah.
how much that work ever
Okay.
goes to here, but
right.
because she
Just
does
as
a
everyone's
lot of work
wrapping
in
up,
biometrics.
One-
And
oh,
works a bit
I've got a little
different.